Thank you, Board Member Spivey Weber. Yes, the UST Cleanup Fund is going to prominently feature a button for reporting fraud, and it's there already, but it's rather hard to find. So it's going to be prominent on the homepage of the fund in the very near future, as well as links to the cases that Chris has mentioned.
Thank you.
Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to do something a little special here and discuss underground storage tank cleanup in the larger perspective of the state's groundwater contamination issues and priorities, and weigh the funding available to address the various issues. I have 5 different topics today. We're going to highlight resources expended. We're going to talk about program improvements to use those resources more efficiently. We are going to step back and look at other sources of groundwater contamination and, as I mentioned, assess the alignment of those resources with the groundwater priorities. And finally, we'll take a look forward as the UST Cleanup Fund sunset approaches. It is now less than 3 years away. And I do want to mention that this presentation is intended to also serve as a standalone resource for stakeholders. So there may be bullets that I don't cover because either time doesn't allow, or it's not really anything you folks need to hear about because you already know it. But that's part of the purpose here. As far as resources expended, I do want to take a minute first to clarify terminology I'll be using today. We talk about cases and we talk about claims, and there are different numbers for each, so I thought it would be useful to clarify that. The case is the term that the regulators primarily use, and it refers to a UST site, but more than that, it refers to the project to clean it up. We talk about case managers managing their projects to clean up or close these cases. And that's Kevin Graves' world and the regional boards and the LOPs who work with him. As of now, there are 6,423 open UST cases other than Department of Defense cases throughout California. On the other hand, the claim, I'm going to point to Lisa Babcock, in the fund, that's the term that the UST fund deals with, much like when we have an auto insurance need to be reimbursed for an accident, we file a claim. Similarly, when there's a UST release, folks who are eligible for the fund file a claim to the fund to be reimbursed for costs due to an occurrence. Right now, the UST Cleanup Fund does have a maximum of $1.5 million per occurrence per claim. And the numbers in that world, there's currently 3,500 claims that are active where the fund is processing reimbursements for those claims. There are about 4,700 claims on the waiting list, also known as the priority list. Those primarily are very large businesses. And an important factor is this last point, that the claims can be for either open cases or closed cases. So in the case of those 4,700, many of them are cases are already closed. The work has been done. It's just that the large company is waiting to be reimbursed from the fund for that expenditure. As we turn to cleanup of underground storage tank cases, the primary, but not the only, source of funding is the UST Cleanup Fund. By statute, this fund is limited to addressing petroleum releases from USTs. Since this program began in 1991, there have been many accomplishments to be very proud of, and one is ongoing, that top bullet there. This fund does provide financial assurances for many operating USTs. This is a RCRA Subtitle I requirement that operating USTs have financial assurance in case of a release, and the fund serves that purpose for many operating USTs. In addition, the fund has provided resources to clean up many highly polluted cases, and contaminants have been removed to prevent impacts on water supply wells. Brownfields have been restored. These are excellent accomplishments of this fund. The source of the fund is the UST storage fee, which is added to the fuel purchase price. If we look at how the most recent annual expenditures were made in this past year, I'm sorry it's a little dark there, but this is the pie. The size of the pie is about $255 million for this last year. And you can see that the largest, by far, slice of that pie went to claims, $183 million last year to pay for remediation of the active claims. There are other slices of the pie. The administration portion of it includes the state board's fund personnel and expenses, that's 5.2%. Also includes the Board of Equalization, which assesses and collects the fee on our behalf. There's also a small red pie there, piece on
I'm sorry,
special accounts.
could you go back? What is the State Water Board Fund?
That's the cleanup fund. That's the Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Fund and the Division of Financial Assistance. So Lisa, and roughly, what is it, about 70 staff? Okay. All right. And then the special accounts, that red slice of the pie includes special accounts such as the commingled plume and the emergency abandoned recalcitrant ear account. There is also a slice of the pie there for Kevin. We wouldn't want him to feel left out. That's for regulatory oversight, and that includes the state board program in the Division of Water Quality, the regional board programs, and the LOPs. We'll have a slide later about that too. If we look backward of the total amount expended by the fund, it is $3.2 billion reimbursed to date. This is for the 8,000 claims that are closed now, as well as the 3,500 claims that are currently active. And just so we're clear, all these revenues are committed and expended annually. We don't have a carryover or a special pot of money. We get the money out to do the good. The last bullet there just reiterates that $183 million, I still have trouble with the magnitude of these numbers, of annual reimbursements going for claims. Question?
Yes, could you go back? Of the 3,500 claims that are currently active, how many of those claims are for closed cases?
Looks like something we'd have to check.
We can get those numbers, but I don't have them with me.
And I'm curious, when reviewing the claims, what priorities does the fund provide to open cases versus closed cases?
We don't give that priority. The priority is based on the priority class and the date in of the reimbursement request, the first in, first out. But it's what we do. I'm sorry. Let me restate that, because that's completely not true. We also, for those cases that are closed, we have a unit within our payments group that focuses on case closeout to prioritize and get those closed out. And we, at that point in time, we do a retrospective audit of all the reimbursement requests we've gotten over time to make sure that we haven't overpaid or underpaid.
You can guess why I'm asking these questions, and that is with the implementation of our low threat closure policy and the encouragement for low threat sites to be closed. Certainly one of the encouragements might be that their claims after closure get processed and reimbursed as quickly as possible.
And that is correct. That is what we do.
I mentioned the slice of the pie that's for the regulatory oversight. This just shows that water board program-wise, the underground storage tank is the largest program. That's the bar on the left. This is from a presentation Eric Oppenheimer gave to the board last April on resource expenditures by fund. I want to talk for a few minutes about things that we're doing to try to use the resources more efficiently. The thing that I think I'm the happiest about is the current picture of operating underground storage tanks There's about 40,000 total in the state at this point. And in terms of environmental protection, that box on the right, the red is the poor environmental protection afforded by the single-walled tanks. What I'm happy about is that they're really only about 5% now of the population of operating underground storage tanks. And you could see a large number in that green zone. 85% of the operating tanks are now very good environmental protection. Those are double-walled tanks and piping. And even better yet is the gold standard there, the vacuum pressure hydrostatic underground storage tanks, which are required since 2004, and they are now about 10% of the population. In the past, that pie used to be larger. There were a lot more underground storage tanks, and the slice of the pie that was the single-walled tanks was much larger. So the program has come a long way in having modern, environmentally protective design that provides excellent environmental protection. And really, as a result of that, we have very few new leaked cases every year, about 100 per year. And they are primarily newly discovered old leaks, not new leaks from these high-performing, generally operating underground storage tanks. And so the net result of that is that we have primarily a legacy program to clean up legacy cases with a shrinking universe of cases to address. Now it's not advancing. There we are. We do have our challenges. The last page, the last slide on this presentation has many references, including an EPA report that shows different agency performance and many other facts and figures. It does show that the average case has been open for 17 years, and it does show that according to our current information, many cases are not yet assessed and then not necessarily being remediated or closed. I do expect that the board's low threat closure policy and resolution 2012-62 will help to move sites along as they do their path to closure plans, as board member Doduk just mentioned. But in a nutshell, you know, California continues to spend a very large amount of funding paid for by folks purchasing fuel to fund this remediation. And we have seen a very dramatic increase in the average expenditure per claim. The closed claims, that roughly 8,000 that have been closed already, the total average was about $180,000 per claim. Currently, however, we're seeing claims in the neighborhood of $500,000 per claim and counting. And we're projecting that by the time those currently active claims are closed, there will be probably a total of about $750,000 per claim expended.
I'm assuming that there might be multiple claims per case. So do you have an average in terms of expenditure per case?
Do you keep that information, Kevin?
We don't, but I'm going to speculate that there are few multiple claim cases.
What I would say.
And this slide will be familiar to board members because it's all actions that you have taken over the last few years to move the sites along, to close the cases that should be closed, and to move the remaining cases along on the path to closure.
I have a question on the growth in the size, the amount of money being spent on each claim. Why?
That's a very good question. Why? There are probably multiple reasons. Certainly, it's quite probable that many of the less significant cases where it was fairly easy to remediate and clean up, those are the ones that may have gotten cleaned up and closed and reimbursed. And that could be one reason that the so-called low-hanging fruit was reflected with those earlier claims. However, you know, you heard from Mr. Kerrigan about fraud that can inflate costs. And there may also just be available money tends to get spent, and so that may be another factor too. And the fund does reimburse only for reasonable and necessary costs, but this can be a point of contention, and there may be some costs that we wouldn't think were necessarily needed.
I think inherent in the fact that you have a case open each year, even if the work that's being done is groundwater monitoring, it keeps adding up. So the length of the time, simply the length of the time a case is open, money is being reimbursed for some work. Also, as more and more cases are undergo remediation, some of that remediation may not be necessary now in terms of the criteria that the board has recently adopted with the policy. So it is possible that cases that are, and remediation is by far the highest cost, energy costs and so on. So it is possible that we find in some cases that remediation is going on, which may not be necessary now in terms of the criteria of the low threat policy.
Does the fund have specific criteria and guidelines for determining what is reasonable and necessary? And if so, has that been updated to reflect the criteria in the low threat closure policy?
Right. Well, the cost guidelines have been published. They are tied in with the unit costs that are reasonable. The challenge is, what is the necessary work? So in terms of the cost guidelines of what are reasonable necessary costs, unit costs, we have that information. It should be updated. However, the criteria for whether the work is actually necessary, the work is reasonable and necessary, is what our technical staff review, and we're working in light of the policy criteria. I mean, really, the board has adopted the policy criteria, and as we go through the cases, that's what we are looking at.
And how do you ensure consistent interpretation and analysis of what's reasonable and required?
Now that the policy has been adopted, we work closely with DWQ in terms of interpreting the policy. It's a matter of having the time per case to go back and look at the actual information about that particular case. In other words, we have reimbursement requests that come in, and then it's a matter of how much time do you spend looking at the details of that particular case to determine what's reasonable and necessary. But we are working on that.
If I can chime in, I know that there's case studies where the fund staff and DWQ staff sit down together and try to reconcile and get on the same page. So that is a regular occurrence too, to try to sort of calibrate.
And I would say that the reviews of the reviews that the low threat policy implementation plan asks us to do through the 5-year review program and through DWQ's efforts to take a look at all of the case reviews that the regions and locals are doing, that is going to provide a great normalizing factor across the state that we have not had in the past.
So I'll go back to where we were. Moving on to fraud, you just heard from Chris Kerrigan about this. I think the main thing I'll say here is that last point, that the Cleanup Fund is taking the lessons learned from both the audit and the Office of Enforcement's findings and applying them towards fraud prevention. Also, there are unintended environmental consequences, I would say, of UST cleanup. This came to my attention when I learned that it wasn't at all uncommon for the fund to receive a request for reimbursement of a utility bill of $5,000 a month. That's a fair amount of electricity being spent. This is primarily on cleanup, active remediation systems tend to use a lot of electricity. And we've had a preliminary staff finding. This is something that's being actively looked at, and we're thinking something in the range of 5 to 30 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions equivalent for active cleanup site. A US EPA calculator would put that at something like the total emissions from a vehicle, either from 1 to 6 vehicles per year. And this does not include many other related activities, driving around and conducting the sampling Lisa just mentioned, et cetera. So, you know, in some cases, this is a very necessary thing to do, and the greenhouse gas production is a necessary evil, but it is also true, we believe, that there are cases that should be closed and the greenhouse gas production could be avoided. And finally, that last point, that when soil and groundwater pollution is cleaned of hydrocarbon, the hydrocarbon doesn't just vanish, it can very easily turn into air quality problems. And now moving on to the groundwater, statewide groundwater picture of how USTs compare to other sources of contamination. I'm going to start with domestic wells. These are shallow, and therefore you might think more readily affected by UST releases. The data here with both domestic wells and the smaller water systems that have less than 15 service connections, the data is very uncertain because there is no state requirement to test or count or report on these systems. Ours and CDPH's best estimates are that there's between 250,000 to 600,000 domestic wells or small systems, small unregulated systems, serving a population of perhaps 2 million people. I will note that even though there's no statewide requirement for testing, the state water board's groundwater assessment and monitoring program, GAMMA, has had a voluntary well program where they have tested and found pathogens and nitrates, among other contaminants. But we do have recent information. US EPA contracted with the Sullivan International Group to assess effects in California from USTs on municipal and domestic wells. And I'll go right to the bottom line there, which is that out of all of the cases that they looked at, there were only 54 domestic wells that regulators confirmed were currently impacted by UST cases within the state. So 54 wells or very small systems, that's still 54 too many, and I do want to emphasize that my information is that these sources have now got either wellhead treatment or an alternative source because the fund will pay for that. And there may be more. This is just the currently impacted. There may be some potential impacts, but even so, even if you even doubled that number, as you see that percent, it is an extremely small percent of the total population of domestic wells.
If I could jump in on that, this data is available because of your State Board Resolution 0942, which required the regulators to assess the environmental impacts of UST sites, and this was one of the data fields that they filled out.
So if we move on to the same report and what they found about municipal wells, again, very few cases seem to be affecting municipal wells, and some of the cases are affecting the same well as other cases. So if you move on to look at, well, how many wells are affected by USTs, the report reports 27 currently impacted by UST cases within the entire state. And there are also potential impacts rather than known current impacts, but again, 27 is a very low percentage of the wells in the state, and I'll talk in a minute about the AB 2222 number there.
And are you you satisfied and confident that in these 27 municipal cases, as well as the other domestic ones, that the tanks associated with these impacts are given the high level of attention and action necessary in order to address the pollution and to resolve
They
these
certainly
impacts?
should have been all along, and if they weren't before, that should be abundantly clear now with the board's adoption of 2012-62, which does enumerate impacts on wells as the number one of the 3 reasons why a case should be considered high priority.
So that would be information that you would expect to have in our database by August of this year, as well as part of the path to closure plan that's due by the end of the year.
By the end, yes, this year, isn't it?
This year,
2015.
yep.
I was going to call that next year. You're correct. Okay, yes. So when I keep having to scroll and nothing happens, Janine, what does that mean? Is it running out of juice? Oh, there. Operator error, perhaps, but I was scrolling. I have to go back. I did go too far. There we are. Okay. The AB 2222 draft report is one that I believe you heard an information item on at the end of 2011. It is a report the State Water Board has on its website, and it addresses systems that are groundwater reliant and those that have had, of the population studied, there are about 1,662 active wells that had a principal contaminant exceed the MCL twice during the period 2002 to 2010. So for purposes of this presentation, we're going to call those contaminated wells. And this is going to be how we look at what are the other potential contaminants affecting these wells. And that's on the next slide here. These are the top 10 principal contaminants, again, the ones with MCLs that were detected in the AB 2222 report. And you see a mix of natural and anthropogenic sources. The highest is arsenic, followed by nitrate, not surprisingly. You also see a number of solvents, starting with tetrachloroethylene, PCE, not surprising. But you don't see benzene on this list of the top 10. And, you know, where is the benzene? Well, here's the chart from AB 2222 draft report, and it shows encircled in red the benzene and the MTBE are way out on this chart and way low in numbers compared to, on the left, I've circled nitrates and PCE as a sample solvent to just show you the relative impact on wells found in this report. If we take that information and translate it into a map, this is a map of nitrates throughout the state, also from the same report. Lots of dots. You look at the map of benzene, very few dots. You look at the map of MTBE, even fewer dots. So if we take those numbers and just do a quick analysis, the report found only 6 wells contaminated with benzene, and at least 2 of these were not even due to UST releases. So if you take the remaining 4 that did have the reported levels greater than the MCL of benzene, and you add in the 4 wells that are MTBE that weren't already counted, you get 8 wells that could be traced to USTs, and that is 0.48% of the 1662 contaminated wells. So we've already even narrowed the denominator down to just the wells that are contaminated, and we're looking how much were USTs responsible for, and it is a very, very low percentage. And so now let's look at the alignment of resources with these groundwater priorities. The board is familiar with the UC Davis nitrate report, which has focused attention, and we're developing a report to the legislature. In the meantime, this viewpoint editorial appeared in the Sacramento Bee the day after Christmas and made the point, written by two legislators, that most of us assume we're going to have clean water when we turn on the faucet, but for 2 million Californians, this isn't guaranteed at all, very unfortunately, and largely due to nitrates and arsenic. Having been the deputy director that was here for the board's approval of a $2 million funding from the cleanup and abatement account, it couldn't help but strike me as an interesting comparison. $2 million that the board allocated from cleanup and abatement to CDPH for interim drinking water for severely disadvantaged communities who are pursuing a long-term solution to their nitrate contamination problem. This is going to do a lot of good. 2,700 service connections, that would be families largely, will get 2 years of interim drinking water supply from this $2 million allocation. If we take that same $2 million and we take it into the UST cleanup world, we get a very different picture. At the average burn rate now, we'd be looking at 4 claims. That's at the $500,000 per claim. If we project out till those claims are closed, that would be 2.6 claims. If we see a maximum amount claimed, which is not uncommon, of the 1.5 million, that would be 1.3 claims. And I will just point out that at many of these UST sites, at this point, work done with this funding will not significantly improve public health. And so to do a sort of side-by-side comparison, and there's a bit of apples and oranges going on here, so you'll have to forgive that we don't have as good a picture as we'd like. But on the left, you'll see groundwater contamination sources, and on the right, the funding to address those sources. The sources, I've started with USTs again. By any of the studies referred to, the contaminated wells from the AB 2222, as well as the Sullivan report on both domestic and municipal wells, by any of those measures, less than 1% of the wells are currently being affected. If you take PCE as a typical solvent, they are far more prevalent, about 10% of those contaminated wells. And nitrates is far more prominent still, with 27% of the contaminated wells. And on the other side of the equation, if we look at the funding that's available, the UST Cleanup Fund is currently providing $183 million per year to address UST cleanup. In contrast, for PCE and other solvents, if there is no viable responsible party, the state really has no ongoing funding source for this, and it is really, if there's a water district affected by solvents, it's really that water district's ratepayers that are carrying the burden of wellhead treatment for orphan sites. And similarly for nitrates, although there is capital funding available from CDPH, there is no ongoing funding of the very large O&M operating and maintenance costs for these systems, again, other than water district ratepayers. And I will note that, unfortunately, it is small disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately affected by nitrates in this state. And when I can get this to scroll down, we'll look at looking forward.
Liz, are you going to be making this this information available to CDPH as they, internally can deal with a lot of these issues, as well as the legislature who is doing editorials and that sort of thing, so that there's a grounding in terms of not so much that there's so much money going into this other problem as there's practically no money
Yes.
going into what is a large problem too.
Yes, thank you. Yes, CDPH is aware. I've sent them the presentation, albeit rather at the last hour, but they and everyone can view it on the UST Cleanup Fund's website after this board meeting is over. We will have it posted. And with regard to the legislature, I've already been in contact with Rob Eagle, our legislative director, to see if he thought there might be interest in legislative staff.
Well, and I would also say to Tom, this is something that certainly the Secretary should know about, and EPA folks as they grapple with kind of what to do.
Thank you. So again, looking forward, I want to touch on operating USTs because, again, make sure everybody is clear that the risk of new releases has been vastly reduced. This is very good news. But the UST Cleanup Fund does currently provide this important function of providing the insurance for these operating USTs. I will note that we have learned that many California USTs also use private insurance as well as the fund, and that many other states have private insurance or a public-private entity that manages the financial assurances aspect of operating USTs. And as the cleanup fund sunset date approaches, and we're really looking at a program wind down, a fund wind down, and orderly wind down, now that the date is less than 3 years away, the state board itself has taken some very important actions to move cases towards closure, close the ones that are low threat. And we are looking at what other states that have faced a UST fund sunset have done. There's several who have successfully sunset their funds, Texas and Arizona. And what they did that our state is currently lacking is they did build in interim deadlines and dates into their fund sunset. Right now we have, to use an overtired term, we have a cliff scenario right now where the current statute has fund one day and no fund the next day, and that really is not very workable for us or the regulated community or our claimants. So these are some things that other states have done. They've had a deadline when operating USTs must switch to a different financial assurance mechanism. They've had dates for claim eligibility and processing for requests for reimbursement. So that's food for thought. And last, you know, this juxtaposition of the contaminant sources versus the funding available, I do think that's a very large issue. We would all agree. And the groundwater strategic plan that Board Member Dodek mentioned earlier, I think we'll be looking at this. It's certainly reviewing the solvents issue and the nitrates issue. And of course, there is the upcoming nitrate report to the legislature. So there's several venues that the Water Board will be pursuing on this issue, but it's way beyond us. It is obviously something that the legislature and others will need to look at the recommendations we do provide. So with this last slide with all the references available for people, that concludes my presentation. I thank you for your interest and ask if there's any further questions.
I do have just a comment. I want to thank Liz, and of course, I'm sure you had other input in the presentation. But this was, you know, exactly the kind of analysis that I was hoping to get when the board undertook the resource alignment effort, because, you know, given the multiple challenges that we have and the limited resources that we have, it is so important for us to look at how our resources are being used and align that, obviously, with the priorities in terms of threat to water quality, to drinking water in the state. And so I was so pleased to look at your presentation and to have this kind of analysis being done. And you're absolutely right that as we move forward on both the nitrate report to the legislature, on our groundwater strategic plan, on other effort, the timing is ideal with, again, the sunset of the program, to think from a broader perspective the way that we can shape and build a foundation for the board's future work in addressing the groundwater contaminants that are so critical and so much more in terms of the impacts to drinking water in the state than obviously the great work that has been done to address petroleum and underground storage tank sites. And so the analysis, I think, is well done, well timed, and like I said, the perfect outcome from the resources alignment effort that we undertook. So I thank you, congratulate you, and I would encourage Tom that we look for other opportunities in the board's various programs to do similar kind of analysis to determine where our shift, where we need to make the necessary shift in order to focus on the priorities that we need to focus upon. So Liz, you got off the gate first and did a great job. Thank you.
I'd like to second that, and but I also there's another major program that we've just dealt with, and that's the now it's sanitary, no, not just sanitary sewer systems, but the septic systems, and so we need to be. Somehow that needs to be incorporated into our groundwater program and assessment. I mean, where do septic systems fall into the threat to groundwater? And particularly with Hannah Beth Jackson back in the legislature, she might be interested in that as well.
Thanks for reminding me of that. One thing I would say, Liz, when you give your list that includes, you know, the various sources of contamination, I don't think we should ever assume that someone, particularly in the legislature, where most of them have just graduated, hopefully from high school, in the last year or two, will realize which sources are anthropogenic, which sources are from petroleum, which sources can come from, you know, multiple directions. I think it's important that we look at that. I say that because of some of the comments I've heard about arsenic. You know, so many people assume that some of the arsenic contamination we have, you know, is from man-made sources, and yet the reality is when we're addressing nitrate cleanup in drinking water, we could very well be cleaning up arsenic at the same time, and potentially some of the other constituents that you mentioned, whether they be anthropogenic or not, and some of them, I guess, could come from multiple sources. But I think for clarity, you know, dealing, you know, you have, and your staff have worked with these issues long enough that you assume everybody else knows all the sources, and I think that clarity would be important going forward.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Excellent point, Chair Hoppen. We'll try to modify the slide to show that, but we'll also take that message forward with the groundwater strategic plan because it's an important point.
That's really good. Oh, could I just make one comment, Chair? I wanted to acknowledge Board Member Dodek's leadership on this issue. It's been really important, and for both resource alignment, a higher level resource alignment for our board, but really on the tank issue. And I would just offer this positive note that, you know, my perception really on underground storage tank management is this is a success story. This state has been successful in preventing domestic and municipal well contamination. You know, one of the things lost, I think this is an honest, important, broad perspective you provide, and we need to continue with, but what is lost is what was the threat over time. So you've given us a good static picture of groundwater management and contaminants, but there's a dynamic component of migration of plumes and containment. So I don't want that to be lost, that this program has been successful and important. We don't know exactly how many wells we've prevented from contamination over the years, but we know we have. And that's really important. I want to congratulate staff on that as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to add my thanks to all the well-said comments and suggestions. It's really good. It even exceeded my expectations, which were high. So I'll look forward to sitting. I sort of like to sit down with that bar chart with whoever from your program and beyond should be there just to do a brainstorm about groundwater contamination sources and all of that, if you don't mind, as a follow-up.
Certainly be glad to do that. I want to acknowledge the Division of Water Quality and John Borkovich and his managers who've provided assistance with this, and Janice Sinke, and I'm sure that they and we could participate with you in that.
Great. That'd be great.
The board was presented with an information item from the AB 222 report prior to your being here. So.
And just one final comment for Tom. This has been, I think, the best, back-to-back informational items we've had on our agenda. So thank you, and I would cross my fingers and hope for other similar high-level, high-quality presentations in the future. The new standards have been set. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you. Tom, before we start with item number 5, let's take a break until 10 minutes of, and we'll resume with item number 5.